And beyond that, a broader aspiration was set to mobilize 1.3 trillion annually from all sources, including private finance. Well, private finance, huge problem. We can talk about that later in the discussion. And direction to the new targets were far from celebratory, kindly said. Many countries who are most affected from the climate crisis strongly criticized this agreement, arguing that the new climate finance goal falls far short of what is truly needed and ignores very ignores the historic responsibility of wealthy nations like my own Germany. So there was a lot of frustration also about the lack of short-term delivery plans and the continued dominance of loans over grants, which is also a huge problem. So in summary, COP29 gave us headlines, headline numbers, but beneath this lies a huge deep divide. And the next chapter, heading to COP30 in Brazil, it will be a test. First, will rich nations move towards a just and accountable delivery of climate finance? And also very important, will we achieve that the fossil fuel industry and also the super rich people living on this planet will pay their fair share? So at the SB in Bonn, discussion will focus on a pathway to mobilize the 1.3 trillion in climate finance through the so-called Baku to Belem roadmap. And for a climate just finance solution, there is needed a huge pressure still from civil society, from countries. And so what will be the solutions and what will be the next steps? I think we can then heading to the debate later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think there is some, Frank, if you can help me with the video. It was a great presentation, and I totally agree with you with regard to the climate finance falling short. What what the demand was for 1.3 trillion per year, and what was promised in the last climate COP was 300 billion, which is nothing. And as you talked about the loss and damage and mitigation adaptation, so this amount is totally falling short, even when it was promised 100 billion earlier on the talks of climate finance. Even at that time, we are very aware it was so hard to mobilize the money and had that mechanism in place. And it was much later when we entered 2025. Then towards the end, they started mobilizing, and even then they could not meet, the global north could not meet the promise of 100 billion at that time. So we are falling short, and we are in the middle of climate crisis, and we are hoping to have many questions. I don't see any questions right away in the chat box. Anybody who has questions for Catherine, please put it in the chat box, and we can take all the questions together at the end after all the speakers have spoken, if you're fine with that, Catherine. I have also a couple of questions, so maybe we all can deal it in the open discussion later on, if that's fine. So I think, great. I think I'll move on to our next speaker. We have Alison Lamb. Alison is a scholar and an activist specializing in social environmental citizenship, sustainability, and social justice with leadership in gender equity, participatory democracy, and global coordination. Within the Green Party of Canada, she serves as the critic for intergovernmental affairs, women and gender, on the shadow cabinet, as well as the co-chair of International Secretariat. Alison is active in the Global Greens Climate Working Group, Biodiversity Working Group, and Strengthening Democracy Network, focusing on the intersectionality of these topics and the impact of gender issues. I welcome you, Alison. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Frida. And thank you for everyone who has done a lot of work in organizing this webinar. Thank you so much. So permit me a second to share my slides. There we go. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I am calling from, and please, everybody who practices land acknowledgements, take a moment to consider the lands that they're on. I am calling from Treaty 13 lands. They're the territories that are traditionally stewarded by the Wendat peoples, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And it's really important for me to acknowledge Indigenous peoples in the land because a lot of what I am presenting today was influenced by the Indigenous peoples that I met at COP. When I was at COP16, I met many Indigenous women fighting to make gender a priority in environmental justice and climate action. I became very close with some of them, one in particular, who I'm very honored now calls me her little sister. We have since had many discussions about climate and gender, and she has undeniably influenced me, particularly in this talk. So this is a quote that we've all heard before, but what does it actually mean? Climate change and mitigation must always be viewed through a gender lens because impacts of climate change always disproportionately affect women and girls. I was speaking on gender-based violence, and it always amazes me how many people don't recognize it for what it is. Many people think of gender-based violence as physical or intimate partner violence, but I'm going to speak about it in the context of climate justice today. Whether speaking of peace and security, education and training, or food insecurity, women always find themselves in the center of trauma. Women in the labor market already face persistent gaps in employment, social protection, pay, working conditions, decision-making spaces, and the challenge of unpaid cross-generational care work. I'm going to go back a few years just to be able to kind of set a path for where I'm heading into COP30. At COP28, they had the first ever Gender Day, recognizing that climate affects gender disproportionately. We always hear about it in vague terms, but we rarely hear specific examples. One story told at COP28 about indirect consequences of climate change was from Bangladesh. And this one was about rising sea levels. High sea levels cause salination in the rivers and communities along those rivers ingest this water. Among other things, the increased salinity has deep impact on skin, causing skin blotching and irritation. These particular communities that are drinking this water in Bangladesh have higher incidence of child marriage because families want to ensure that their children are married before girls develop skin blotches, making them undesirable. When a girl child of 12 or 14 years old, or maybe sometimes even younger, is forced to marry, that is gender-based violence. I had a debate with a man once who said mothers are revered in their culture, and I had a very Western way of thinking if I think motherhood is gender-based violence. I replied that no matter how much she is revered, that most certainly is gender-based violence if the mother is only 12 years old or obligated to have children when she didn't want any. Child marriage disproportionately increases when there is food scarcity and forced migration due to climate change, because families can no longer afford to support the girls or need to trade them for livestock. A girl out of school is at risk of being married off to a much older man. Her education and aspirations ended, leaving her vulnerable to intimate partner violence and HIV due to an imbalance of power, not to mention being forced to have children at a very young age. Women and girls often lose control of their right to family planning and the ability to manage their reproductive health. Another aspect of gender and climate is clean cooking. And you might wonder, what does clean cooking have to do with gender and gender-based violence and climate change? Clean cooking is about gender equality and economic justice and rights. There is a disproportionate impact faced by women without access to clean cooking solutions. Cooking with fire takes too much time to gather firewood for girls and women and does not allow for girls to go to school or for women to seek their own income. Climate change causes forced migration that makes girls and women travel further and further to collect firewood and water, where they are not only required to give up their time from personal pursuits, to suffer physical damage to their bodies from a young age due to heavy lifting over long distances, but also to become more vulnerable to physical attacks while alone, because they're definitely gathering this firewood alone. Lack of clean cooking also leads to respiratory and pulmonary diseases. 4 million women, more than malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV combined, die per year from internal pollution due to cooking at home. Extreme heat is becoming one of the biggest challenges to everyone, but particularly to women, and even more so to women in the global south, who work in positions outside in the informal economy. They're in fields, factories, markets, and they're doing work that becomes absolutely impossible if temperatures reach 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. This is by far the biggest killer in deaths that are related to climate, is extreme heat. These statistics and personal stories were numerous at COP28, highlighting the ways in which the intersectionality of climate and gender result in gender-based violence. But despite being the first COP with a gender day, there is only a single reference to the Lima Work Program on Gender in the final outcome statement. The lack of emphasis implies a deprioritization of gender-responsive action. So what is the Lima Work Program on Gender? It was created in 2014 to be renewed in 5 years and then extended for another 5 years. This is the overarching policy that ensures dissemination of information about gender and calls on countries to develop their own gender plans and requests support for those countries without the means to do it. It's meant to enhance gender balance and integrate gender into policies, and the whole purpose is to mainstream gender considerations. In 2019, the Gender Action Plan was added to supplement it. If the Lima Work Program is the framework and the mandate, then the Gender Action Plan is the roadmap with concrete actions. This action plan has 5 priorities. First, there's capacity building through knowledge and communication, and it promotes gender balance and participation in leadership. It supports coherence to ensure gender is consistently integrated in all processes. And it supports gender responsive implementation, like ensuring there is gender responsive financing that allows girls to stay in school or make available clean cooking and sexual reproductive health. And finally, there's an aspect of monitoring and reporting on progress of gender commitments. The aim since 2019 has been to enhance the Gender Action Plan over a period of 5 years, and a synthesis report was expected to be presented at COP29. But then what happened at COP29? Going in, the plan was to adopt the Lima Work Program and extend it for a further 10 years before developing a draft of the new Gender Action Plan. But a lot of conflict was encountered immediately. There was disagreement on the wording. Some countries wanted women in all their diversity and gender in all its diversity to be replaced with specifically women or men. Also, they also wanted the removal of instances or mentions of gender-based violence and intersectionality. Countries gave the same argument I mentioned at the very beginning, not recognizing gender-based violence for what it is. They raised concerns about how intersectionality and gender-based violence has nothing to do with climate and didn't belong in climate negotiations. There was disagreement over whether it should be a 5-year or 10-year extension. Some countries wanted a 10-year extension with a midterm review. Some wanted a 10-year Lima Work Program, but a 5-year Gender Action Plan. Others wanted to renegotiate everything in 5 years. There was some suspicion of whether countries were holding out on one in order to leverage the other. And there was also the possibility that countries were leveraging the gender aspect against the discussions, the negotiations for the quantum. The final wording was that there would be a 10-year Lima Work Program on gender and a 5-year Gender Action Plan with all references to human rights, gender diversity, gender-based violence, and intersectionality removed. This was said to be a wording that regressed by a decade from what it was before. There was also not enough time to make any mention of any methods of implementation. There was an agreement to review again at SB70 in June 2029, and the recommendation for a draft decision for consideration by COP34 in November of 2029. And there was also recommendation that a technical workshop takes place at SB62 in Bonn to develop the Gender Action Plan, since they didn't have time for it at COP29. So, the Lima Work Program on Gender has been renewed, but just under the wire. The plan had been for a layout of the Gender Action Plan, but that never happened. The Gender Action Plan is now expired, and a new one needs to be adopted at COP30, but official discussions haven't even started yet. Something needs to be in place before arriving in Belem, so that depends on this intersessional. I had just said that one of the final decisions was the workshop at Bonn. This will take place starting today until June 18th. There was a call for submissions related to the workshop that was due March 31st. Documents were prepared beforehand, and including an analysis summary of all the submissions that had been made. There's a QR code on this slide that'll take you to the website with the agenda and supporting documents for the workshop. And hopefully enough work will be done in the next few days to develop a strong recommendation for COP30 without the walking back and obstacles that arose in COP29. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was very much enlightening, even for me, because I don't follow gender. That I have been following youth, but as you said, I'm very aware gender is very important, and how what statistics you have brought is very alarming. And it is very important that all these negotiations that we are seeing, we also see it from the point of view of gender in COP. Thank you so much for your presentation. Like I said to Catherine, we will be having the question answers at the very end. And maybe if you all of you want to add few more remarks on particularly the topic that you have spoken on, or maybe on the climate finance and other things, then we will open the floor for that as well. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very insightful.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Now I would like to invite the next speaker. Lisbeth Gusin is a strategic advisor in climate diplomacy with over 15 years of experience across global negotiations, policy advisory roles, and NGO leadership. Her career spans senior roles in government, international organizations, and civil society, with particular expertise in EU climate policies, international climate finance, and multilateral diplomacy. She serves as senior climate advisor to Belgium Minister Zakaya Katibi, played a strategic role in Belgium's 2024 EU presidency. Prior to this, she led advocacy and program strategy at Oxfam, Belgium, and represented Belgium at the UN Human Rights Council as a member of the permanent representation of Belgium to the UN in Geneva. Lisbeth brings knowledge of the intersections between climate policy, energy transition, climate finance, and development. You are very welcome for the webinar, Lisbeth. We are very honored to have you. You have the floor for your presentation.
Thank you, Sinda, for giving me the floor. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to engage with you, even if I don't see all the participants in this webinar. Let me first confirm that you're absolutely right to highlight that the Bonn session is an important moment between two COPs. A COP is prepared as soon as one COP ends. And there are many meetings, Copenhagen Ministerial, the meetings in Petersburg or in Berlin. There will definitely be discussions around the opening of the General Assembly in New York. But this session in Bonn is the only formal meeting, and it's the only meeting that gathers all parties and that will address all the agenda items. So even if parties do not manage to prepare for decisions that should be taken at COP30, the positions do crystallize because it's a formal meeting and because all the issues have to be addressed. So I really wanted to underline that. But I will speak to the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and a bit more broadly on mitigation. And when I turn to the NDCs, indeed, they are an important feature under the Paris Agreement. Contrary to the Kyoto Protocol, several countries, developing countries, were given targets. How much or to which degree did they have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? Under the Paris Agreement, there was a global or a global target set of the 1.5 degrees that should not be passed. But every country, including developing countries, had to prepare their NDCs in a bottom-up way. They're not negotiated. So there is a role for you to engage with your country or in your constituency or with your stakeholders to influence that nationally determined contribution of a certain country. Now first, and I will share a presentation, let's see where we are. because this is the third round of nationally determined contributions. They were due in February, but there was a formal extension of that deadline to September, which will still allow for the Secretariat to prepare for a summary and to take stock of where we are collectively. But the UNFCCC, the Secretariat of the Climate Convention, already prepared for such a synthesis report in 2024 based on current nationally determined contributions. And you will see that based on these contributions, emissions would reduce by around 6% by 2030. And if we exclude those that have conditional elements, it would be actually around 1% higher, an increase in emissions by 2030. While we know from scientists that we actually need to collectively cut emissions by 43% by 2030. So we are not on track currently. And it is in this context that countries need to prepare for the new and next NDCs. And where we are from that point of view. About 22 countries have already submitted their NDC, both developed and developing countries. When it comes to the developed countries, including some G20 countries, like the UK, Canada, but also Japan, Brazil, and the US. We should see what happens with that as the Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement. Also, smaller countries have already submitted their NDC, Ecuador, Marshall Islands, or Kenya. But a lot of NDCs are still due, including the EU, think of India, China, Mexico, Indonesia. They will have or bring important contributions as well. Because based on what we know now, of those 22 countries that already have submitted their NDC, that only reduces with 1.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, reduces only that little the amount of emissions in the atmosphere. And there is a huge gap between where we are now and where we have to go to. And that is an important thing to hold on to. We're not on track now. We're unlikely to be on track before COP30. What will we do with that information? What will the presidency of COP30 do with that information? How will that be captured in a cover decision, in other workshops, under other agenda items of the COP? I think that is important already to reflect what would you want to see happen with that information, and yes, what would you suggest or ask from the presidency and other stakeholders to do with this information? On a more national level, if you know countries that still need to prepare for their nationally determined contribution, here is a kind of checklist for you to keep in mind when you engage with countries. Is your NDC aligned with the 1.5 limit? Does it have the 2035 time frame? It's good for countries to have long-term ambition in terms of climate neutrality, but we need shorter-term targets as well. Does it include a revision of the 2030 ambition? Because as I said, we are not on track currently. Does it provide information on how it links with the outcome of the global stocktake? Does it contain a lot of conditionalities? For example, certain countries say, I will only have that ambition, or I will only undertake that activity if in turn I receive finance or I receive other types of support. So these are things you can take with you when considering upcoming NDCs, and of course also the important information that was given regarding gender, or have local communities been included in the process to draft the NDCs. So as I said, as such, the NDCs are not negotiated. We can look at places where the urgency can be reflected in the process. And I will speak to two points, two areas on the agenda of the COP and now in Bonn, where that provides such opportunity. First, there is the United Arab Emirates dialogue that was part of the global stocktake in Dubai. Remember the global stocktake. It deals with a lot of subjects, including adaptation, finance. which the colleague has spoken to, but also parts of mitigation, and addresses several sectors like the necessary energy transition. And in the section of finance, it established this dialogue, which had to be operationalized during the COP in Baku, but parties couldn't agree. This dialogue is not operationalized yet. Parties couldn't agree mostly on the scope of this dialogue. Some countries don't want actually a follow-up of the global stocktake. Some countries wanted to be limited to follow-up on finance. And some countries, during one of the plenary sessions in Baku, about 125 countries spoke to the need to ensure a meaningful follow-up of the global stocktake. So, as I said, parties couldn't agree in Baku. And what is brought over to this session in Bonn is a heavily bracketed informal note from the presidency, the Azerbaijani presidency, to this session in Bonn. And so this is something tangible for you to engage on. How will this dialogue allow us to consider, to reflect the urgency to tackle the climate crisis, to note the fact that we are collectively not on track, and to ensure follow-up of different parts of the global stocktake, including when it comes to the energy transition, the transport sector, or others. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on. Another work, so this is a checklist. Still, there are different bits and pieces within the global stocktake that will allow you to engage with stakeholders to ensure there is a meaningful follow-up of things that were decided in the context of the global stocktake. And then a second avenue for you to consider mitigation during this Bonn session and later on COP30 is the mitigation work program. It was established in Glasgow in a cover decision, again following the information that in 2021 already we were collectively not on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as we should. And to grasp the sense of urgency, the then presidency, the UK, decided to create the mitigation work program. And as always, the scope of this mitigation work program had to be decided on during the next COP, which was in Egypt, when most of the attention was going to the creation of the loss and damage fund. And then the mandate of this mitigation workshop, where it was a bit intended to grasp that urgency, to ensure regular follow-up, because remember, the global stocktake is only every 5 years. This mitigation work program allows to have an annual follow-up and stocktaking of where we are, and in theory, to decide on actions needed to make sure we are in line with the commitments of the Paris Agreement. But here is the mandate that was actually decided upon in Sharm el-Sheikh. It is no clear reaffirmation of the 1.5 limit, of the urgency, doesn't really grasp that sense of urgency. It's very clear that it's non-prescriptive. It doesn't address different sectors as has done the IPCC as well, for example. We don't use that information formally in this mitigation work program. And then it only runs until 2026. During next COP, in COP31, the decision will have to be taken on where do we go with this mitigation work program. So the decisions during every COP since Egypt have been very, very difficult. And we only managed collectively to have a procedural outcome of this mitigation program. There have been very insightful discussions on energy, on transport, and during this year on the role and the impact for cities, but it's not translated into political messages to the COP, for example, to the formal meetings. There's no link so far with the GHT, nor with the NDCs that countries could revisit or to sharpen their ambition. So when you go to Bonn or in Brazil later this year, when you look at the mitigation work program, for it to be substantial and be meaningful when it comes to the ambition in the Paris Agreement, Does it reaffirm that the important limit of 1.5 degrees and the urgency during this critical decade? Political messages linked to GHG or the current or NDCs or the NDCs deadline of 2035. So these are some sources I wanted to share with you also that you consider on this topic. So I've spoken to the importance of the NDCs, but which as such are not negotiated. And there are different avenues, both on the agenda now in Bonn and later this year in Brazil, for you to really influence or engage in the discussion in terms of mitigation.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. That was a great presentation, and thank you so much for covering a wide range of topics from GST to climate finance to NDCs, which is going to be one of the most important, I thought, the discussion this year. But as you told us that many of the countries have not already submitted their NDCs, and one of the questions that is coming from me before I jump up to the questions that we have in the chat box, what does it mean for us sitting, and working towards global advocacy and a green movement internationally? What does it mean for us when countries are not submitting their NDCs? Does it mean that they no more care? What does it mean? Like it is disappointing that the countries have not submitted their NDCs, and it is one of the most important obligation that the Paris Agreement is putting it on each of these countries. So, what is your analysis of many of these countries failing to submit their NDCs? How would you see it?
Maybe first of all, recognizing that the preparing for the NDC is a very complex exercise. Countries should include all sectors in their economy and their society and all greenhouse gas emissions. They need to make projections over the years, etc. So it is a complex exercise. And let's hope also that countries engage with different stakeholders and civil society in their country. But indeed, it also sends an important political signal to the priority and the importance you attach to the process under the Paris Agreement and the role you have as a state to contribute to ensuring we don't pass beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius. That being said, I think February was difficult for many countries. And let's engage with stakeholders and countries to make sure they respect the September deadline.
Thank you so much. I'll jump up to the next question, and I'll ask this question to Catherine, and you can also jump in. We have a question in the chat box from Khushi, which says, how does climate finance contribute to combating climate change and promoting sustainable development? So maybe Catherine, you want to jump in and answer this?
Yes, sure. So to give an example, to change our energy system, to build up a renewable infrastructure, of course, finance is needed. Finance to invest in small or big companies who are doing that, but also that states-owned companies or the state itself, it's invest in his energy system. The grid, for example, to build better grid connections, but of course also to build up solar and wind power plants. So if there is no finance directing into, for example, the energy infrastructure in a renewable way, then of course there will be no change. And so it's heavily needed that there will be more finance. Right now we have also the problem that, like looking, for example, again into renewable infrastructure, that a lot of investment goes to developed countries, but how to say that, well, less investment goes to countries who really need international support. For example, in the Sahel area of Africa, it would be very necessary to have more investments there in renewable energy, also that villages get electrified. So it's not only about changing the energy system, it's also about having access to energy as a human right. But there is less investment in, for example, the area of the Sahel zone. So it would be very important for a just climate finance to address these issues, that is enough finance everywhere to invest in renewable infrastructure, and at the same time that we do not have financing, and I cannot stress this out enough, into fossil fuel infrastructure. Then also in the Sahel area of Africa, there's a lot of investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, also from European companies. So we have to be very, very clear about that.
Thank you so much. I think for answering that, Catherine, and explaining it so elaboratively to all our participants who are present for this webinar. We have more questions. I'll first jump for a question for Alison. Alison, now this is a question from me. I understand the gender equity is one of the main concerns that we deal with everywhere we are working, but how do you see, how can we integrate gender equality or equity, particularly when we talk about the discussions, the decisions that are coming out of the climate negotiations? Like, do you see uh, how do you see that integration of gender equity in, say, climate finance or other policies, other climate policies for that matter, if you can answer that?
Thank you very much for that question, Snigdha. And I saw that Aaliyah had put in a question in the chat that's very similar to that as well, about any examples where women-led or gender-diverse climate initiatives produce different outcomes compared to mainstream approaches that most of the countries use now. And actually, it all goes together. And forgive me, the audience, if I jump down the rabbit hole a little bit, but it's going to touch a little bit on what Catherine was talking about and what Lisbeth was talking about. Most of you may know or may not, but at the end of the day, COP negotiations are voluntary mechanisms. So they're not treaty binding. They say Paris Agreement is treaty-like, but it's not binding. So a lot of the wording is about encouraging countries or encouraging parties or requesting. So it's very soft language. And then to Maureen's point in the chat about whether pressure can be put on the U.S. U.S. isn't even part of the Paris Agreement, and yet they send parties to be involved in the negotiations, which they're not. They don't have to hold to anyway. So what goes on then, to Snigdha's point, is there are NGOs and they group together, and the women NGO group is actually a very strong group that goes to these COPs and try to influence the negotiations for a more gender perspective. They even have a seat at the table. They even are able to speak even though they don't have a vote. They do make their own contributions, and what they do is basically offline at the side, they would pull negotiators apart to kind of speak their point, to have discussions. Let's grab a coffee, let's grab lunch. So they do their own negotiations offside in order to basically increase their voice in the negotiation along with their own party, along with their own organization as well. And in that sense, the voice has grown stronger. The voice has grown more vocal, and there's more people aware and more accepting that, yes, gender is an aspect that's very important in climate negotiations because it does make a difference. People have to understand that not all genders are treated equally in these talks. So gender responsive financing has to consider whether women are being equitably funded and supported through these. Now, having said that, once these negotiations come through, and I already explained how difficult it was for the Lima Work Program to come through because it was just under the wire. There was so much negotiation going on. Then they go home, and you have the same situation in the government with the NDCs and with those discussions. And it's really dependent on the individual country whether they bring in that women's voice in creating that NDC, in creating the funding and the supports. Some countries have been very good about that. Actually, from what I understand, Bhutan is actually very excellent. They brought in not just women, but gender experts to develop their NDCs, to develop their strategic plans. So, and it makes a difference because we're not just talking about women, we need gender experts, people who actually understand and study gender with respect to climate. So they develop plans that would consider all these gender aspects of financing and of contributions. But not all countries do that. And at the end of the day, like I said, it's a voluntary mechanism. It really depends on the individual country, how much they come through for gender.
Thank you so much, Alison, for your elaborate discussion and your elaborate understanding and making us understand how important it is. I am now jumping to ask question to Lisbeth. Lisbeth, there is a question from Pauline. She's asking if there for NDCs particularly. Her question is if there is any sort of sanction or for the countries who are not submitting or respecting their NDCs. And I'll combine her with her other question, which is on climate finance, which even Catherine can answer, which is like, do we have any idea on how much money would we require per region, like in geographical analysis of any such thing on the climate finance? These are the two questions that I posed to both of you.
Thank you, and that's a very interesting question because indeed countries are, it's not binding as Alison said, but they're not held to any targets, but parties should submit their NDCs under the Paris Agreement. But as with many intergovernmental processes and decisions, the enforcement mechanism is very weak or absent, and that's the case also in this context. So I don't remember where you're speaking from, but it's important to also raise the in your context the political importance of your country submitting such an NDC, which is timely and ambitious and responds to the checklist that I shared with you during this presentation.
And Catherine, if you would want to answer the question on climate finance, do you know, or are we aware of any such research or any such UN-based research which talks about the climate finance? What is the requirement of each region across the world, or we are just seeing it in a more holistic manner as in the platforms of UNFCCC?
Well, there are different ones, and it's so every region, of course, there's like difference. And I also want to add that some regions who are truly right now having a debt crisis already, and then the climate crisis is adding to the debt crisis. So there are a lot of different indicators how much a region truly needs. And also in that region, it's of course a different group of people have different needs. And so there was another question in the chat I also would like to answer. It's about how we can assure that climate finance reaches the most vulnerable person. I think this is a very, very important question. So, for example, the fund for responding to loss and damage. How can we ensure that also indigenous communities, that also specific women, that also young people, that minorities can also be part of or have access to the funds? So for me, one specific demand is that it's not only the contribution of the money is not only over the governments, because if the money goes directly like to the government, sometimes it is not the best way to contribute then to minorities, because sometimes in countries minorities are under threat. Also, if like the government does change. So under Bolsonaro in Brazil, we have to freeze the Amazon climate fund because Bolsonaro wanted to wanted to use the money in his way. But this money is heavily needed for indigenous communities. So the first thing we did was to open the Amazon Climate Fund again after Lula took office. But there is the question, how can we ensure that no matter who is at the government, a specific is it's like a fascist person, that that groups like indigenous groups have still access to the funds. So I think it's very important. This is like one huge demand. The Fund for Responding for Loss and Damage, very well, this is just one example that groups have access directly and not only over the government. So specific in, for example, indigenous communities. And to the first questions, I think it's like also very important to look at what would be the fair share of countries to pay. And for Germany in the last years, there was always the number of 6 billion, but there's a huge possibility. So first, it's not enough, and then there's like the huge possibility that we will not reach this year and the next years, because also our government have changed. So it will be very important to demand from developed countries, for industrialized countries, that they still pay their fair share.
Thank you so much, Catherine. If I can have a follow-up question, I have been part of many of these COPs, and in one of the meetings when we met the International Development Minister of Norway, so what we found out that, at one hand in the COP setup, the countries are saying, particularly the countries in the global north and Europe particularly, they're saying they're promising money, through the channels of climate finance, adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage fund. But on the other hand, when it is coming to their international development money, they are putting that down. So the money that they used to put for international development fund, and that money is going down, and on other hand, they're raising it for COPs within COPs. So somehow we are seeing, that there is a disparity there also. So do you have a comment on that? It is just something which I asked the international development minister from Norway, and then she was surprised that we are talking on this, on raising issues that on one hand you are putting money, but somehow you're taking this money and putting it there, and you're not actually doing enough for the countries in the global south. So do you have any comment on that? Or any of you like?
Yes. So also in my input, I talk like in one sentence about loans and grants. And I think this is also very important to look into, because if, nations like Germany or Europe, Norway, love to give loans, but what is needed are grants. So sometimes loans, of course, can add to debt crisis, specific of regions who are most affected by the climate crisis. So climate finance always must be fair, and that to say is that if we give money with our public money, it should be more. The focus should be more on grants. And not so much on loans, so that we truly can address our responsibility, and also to address the situation of the debt crisis in a lot of regions. I'm not a fan of countries like mine goes to UN conference and telling the world, oh, we will give you like this type of money, but then are quiet about it, how it will be given, loans or grants.
Correct. Thank you so much. I think it is very important. And, as a movement which Global Greens is a movement which is present inside COP, one of our demands is that all this money to be given to the countries in the global south for their just transition in the form of grants, because no more loans would be beneficial for any of these countries, and particularly the huge bloc of African region and even G77, which includes China from the past few negotiations also, has totally said no for the loans. Like the focus is on of the global south is on getting grants than loans. So it was a good discussion. There are a few more questions, and one of the questions that I would like to ask all three of you, the speakers here with us, what do we need to what do we need to see happen in Bonn? Like, what is our expectations from Bonn, the meeting which is happening right now, and what do we want, what are our expectations, and what do we need to see in COP30 for our, like, how do we see what is going to happen in COP30? And particularly, if I say it from the Global Greens perspective, or the perspective of the green parties in the different part of the world, what is your like inputs or your feedback on what Global Greens should do in their work of advocacy and campaign for the upcoming COP, and even for the Green parties or the Green Party members who have joined this from across the group, what should they do for their advocacy and their campaign for the upcoming COP? These are 2-3 questions, and in no particular order you can answer. I think I'll first jump to Alison, and then I'll come to maybe Elizabeth, and then Catherine. If all three of you can answer this question for us,
Thank you
it
very
will help
much,
to
Sigda.
strategize. Thank you,
That, that's
Alison.
a
Please go ahead.
that's a great question. So thank you very much for that. So based on my presentation, from that it's clear that what my aim specifically for gender would be a strong gender action plan coming out of the workshop, something that is not just readily agreed to, almost finished, ready for final review at COP, but also with not just very vague wording. This is supposed to be an action plan. So I would like to see something more concrete and actual steps that will help with implementation, and also for global North countries to be able to support global South countries that would find it challenging to implement. So that is something that I would like to see coming out. And also, a lot of these agreements, we already talked about them being something on paper. They're important, but at the end of the day, it's what we do with these pretty words on pretty paper that makes all the difference. So that's something else that I would like to see, not only with a strong gender action plan ready for final review, ready for adoption at COP, and with actual implementation, methods of implementation written down, but also countries that are ready to commit to them, countries that are ready to take that action. It is an action plan. So I would love to see countries that are ready to commit to the gender action plan and actually take the action, and further that for the 5 years of the action plan and for the 10 years of the Lima work program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Elizabeth, if you want to go next.
Thank you.
And I can repeat the question.
Yeah.
I asked
Thank
so
you.
many at once. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, what I will say obviously complements what Alison just said. It's not this or that, I think. And I think that is an important thing to consider as you want to strategize and are thinking on how to engage with Bonn or Brazil when we go to Belem later this year. Because I've struggled with this as well. Like when we went to Sharm el Sheikh, it was all loss and damage fund. When we went to Dubai, it was mainly, at least in the public discourse, policymakers, the energy transition, and it was finance, the NCQG in Baku. And while, of course, very important, now in Belem, 3 processes will come together. One on finance, that Catherine has spoken to, and the need to align all financial flows with the target of 1.5. The indicators on adaptation need to be decided upon. And I think we shouldn't lose momentum and recognize the urgency on mitigation, which is a subject that has been to the frustration also of many vulnerable countries, of course, how do we make sure that this process is responsive to the fact that we are collectively failing to respect that limit? So in summary, yeah, it's an invitation because I don't have the answer. How do we make sure that this process can handle different subjects and that we engage with stakeholders? We make sure they have a broad spectrum of everything that is needed in the context of the climate crisis. And more specifically, when it comes to mitigation, as I said, I've spoken to follow-up of those NDCs, United Emirates, Arab Emirates Dialogue, and the Mitigation Work Program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisbeth. And Catherine, if I may invite you for the same question.
Yes, broader speaking, also that we find new strategies, how we combat the, well, fascism is sadly rising again in a lot of countries. So how can we, as like the Green Party, as a global movement for climate justice, also stand united against that? I think this is like a very critical moment we are currently living in. And this will be very important because, well, with fascism rises again, of course, it's against human rights, it's against climate justice. And so we have to stand united against that in solidarity. And so also the question of climate denial, which is also rising again, as in a lot of countries with false campaigns about that, and to look behind that and to figure out how we also address the connection between the fossil fuel industry and, of course, the climate denial campaign. So this is, I think, very important to think about, to find new strategies, also together to learn from each other. In Germany, we have a huge problem with the far right rising again, and I heard that's also like a problem in many other regions of the world. So, and of course, we need more money, and we need it also from the fossil fuel industry. That's my last word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you so much, Alison. Thank you so much, Lisbeth. It had been wonderful to see your presentation, to understand from you on different topics. And thank you so much to all the participants. I'm heading towards closing this webinar. This webinar was hosted by Global Greens, and we are very happy to welcome all of you to be part of our climate working group network and any other networks. If you would like to join our networks, you can go to the Global Greens website and just register yourself, and you will give us your email, and you will be able to join us for the work that we are doing towards the climate advocacy and climate justice advocacy, and in sort of trying to frame the bringing together everything, people from different regions coming together to raise their issues inside COP also, and inside COP activism as well. Thank you so much. We are very honored to have all our guests here. You gave us big insight inside what could happen, what is going to happen in Bonn, and also what we are expecting from the COP30, and how to strategize, particularly from the perspective of Global Greens. How do we strategize for the upcoming COP30? And there are a lot of things, from NDCs to climate finance, to Lima work program, and to adaptation mitigation work program. And we hope that we keep on working and keep on engaging with all of you. And thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you all the speakers, and thank you all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Pleasure. Thank you. All the best.